The sirens wailed faintly in the distance, but inside the small gas station on Highway 42, everything felt still, too still. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish, the kind of place that had seen 1,000 travelers come and go. At the counter stood an elderly man in a worn brown jacket, his back slightly bent but his posture proud. His white hair was neatly combed, his boots old but shined, and a small patch on his sleeve read, U.S. Army Retired. He was counting coins slowly, carefully, for a cup of black coffee. Each movement deliberate, not out of weakness but habit. Behind him, a line of impatient customers began to form. A few sighed. One man muttered under his breath. That's when the door swung open, and a young police officer in dark aviator sunglasses walked in. Officer Jake Harlan, 28, swaggered like the badge gave him wings. His uniform was perfectly pressed, his belt gleaming with fresh polish, and his confidence filled the room. He looked at the old man at the counter and smirked. "Hey, old-timer," Jake said loudly. "You planning to pay with nickels all day? Or should I call in backup for counting duty?" A few people chuckled nervously. The old man didn't turn around right away. He finished setting the coins on the counter, looked up at the cashier, and said softly, "That should be exact." The cashier nodded uncomfortably. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Jake stepped closer. "Sir? You hear me?" The old man turned slowly, meeting his gaze. His voice was calm, measured. "I heard you, son." Jake smirked again. "Son? I think you've got that backward. You're in my town, my jurisdiction." The old man raised an eyebrow. "Then maybe you should learn how to speak to people in it." The laughter from the back of the line stopped. Jake's grin faded. "Watch your tone, old man. Watch your pride," the veteran replied simply, picking up his coffee. The officer stepped closer, towering over him now. "You think you can talk to a cop like that?" The old man didn't flinch. He looked Jake straight in the eyes. "I've talked to men who wore that uniform long before you earned yours. And trust me, the ones who deserved it didn't need to remind people they had it." The room went silent. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Jake's jaw clenched as he stepped even closer. "You got an ID on you?" The old man set down his coffee and slowly reached into his jacket. Everyone watched as he pulled out a folded leather wallet. Old, worn, but kept clean. He opened it and handed Jake a driver's license. Jake studied it, unimpressed. "Name's Frank Dalton," Jake read aloud. "Address, this town? You live around here?" Frank nodded. "Born and raised. Bought this coffee here since before you were born." Jake chuckled under his breath. "Sure you did. Look, Frank, you got a problem with law enforcement, you can take it up with the department. But next time you want to play hero, maybe remember you're not in the army anymore." Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're right," he said quietly. "Now I just watch how people wear their uniforms, and what they forget they stand for." Jake froze for a second, not sure if he'd just been insulted. Before he could respond, his radio buzzed. "Unit 24, we've got a 10 to 54. Possible disturbance at the diner on Maple." Jake lifted the radio. "Copy that. On my way." He turned back to Frank with a grin. "Try not to start any wars while I'm gone, soldier." Frank didn't respond. He just picked up his coffee, turned, and walked out into the cool morning air. Jake watched him go, still smirking. But something about that man's quiet confidence stuck in his mind. There was something in the way he carried himself, not arrogance but control. Authority earned, not granted. The doorbell chimed again as the old man left, and the people inside murmured quietly. The cashier shook her head and whispered, "That man comes in every morning. Lost his son overseas a few years ago. Never says much. Just carries himself different, you know?" Jake shrugged. Everyone's got a story. Doesn't mean they can't be rude. But as he walked out, for just a moment, he noticed something he'd missed before. A small, round metal pinned on Frank's jacket, half hidden by the fabric. Bronze with a star-shaped center. Jake squinted. It looked familiar, but he didn't have time to think. The call on his radio buzzed again, pulling him back to work. He climbed into his cruiser and sped off, leaving behind a man who'd already survived more battles than he'd ever face. What Jake didn't know, what no one in that gas station knew, was that Frank Dalton wasn't just any old veteran. He was a man whose courage had once changed an entire platoon's fate. And by the end of that week, it was going to change Jake's life too. The next morning, the sun rose lazily over the small town, painting the quiet streets in gold. Officer Jake Harlan parked his cruiser outside Maple's Diner, the same spot where the department grabbed coffee every shift. He strutted in, nodded at the waitress, and slid into his usual booth near the window. But as he reached for the menu, his partner, Officer Pete Lawson, looked up from his coffee with a smirk. "Hey, Jake, you ticked off another one yesterday?" Jake frowned. "What do you mean?" "That old guy, Frank Dalton," Pete said. "Word travels fast around here. Heard you gave him a hard time at the gas station." Jake scoffed. "Please." The guy was holding up the line and mouthing off. "Old-timers like him think the badge doesn't mean anything." Pete's face turned serious. "You do realize who that is, right?" Jake leaned back. "Yeah, some cranky veteran with a coffee habit." Pete shook his head. "Frank Dalton isn't just any veteran. He's a Silver Star recipient. Saved a whole unit in Iraq 15 years ago. The man's a local legend. You'd know that if you didn't skip half your community briefings." Jake froze. "You're kidding." "I'm dead serious. He's the guy who dragged 3 soldiers out of a burning Humvee under enemy fire, took shrapnel to the shoulder, kept fighting until med-evac arrived. They made documentaries about him, man." Jake felt his stomach drop. "That was him?" "Yeah," Pete said quietly. "That was him." Jake looked out the window, suddenly uneasy. The words from yesterday replayed in his head. "Watch your pride." Before he could respond, his radio buzzed again. "Unit 24, report to 18th and Hillview. Possible trespassing in progress." "Copy that," Jake replied quickly, eager to escape the conversation. He pulled up to the location, a small, boarded-up property near the edge of town. The caller claimed someone had broken into the vacant lot behind the old rail yard. Jake parked, hand on his holster, and stepped out. The gate creaked as he pushed it open. The morning light filtered through broken metal panels, cutting long shadows on the ground. And there, sitting quietly on a wooden crate, was Frank Dalton. He was sipping coffee from a thermos, a small duffel bag beside him. Jake exhaled sharply. "You again? What are you doing here?" Frank looked up calmly. "Just sitting, officer. This used to be the old Veterans Club. I came to pay my respects." Jake frowned. "You can't just sit on private property. There's a sign." Frank nodded toward it. "I know. I put that sign up 20 years ago." Jake blinked. "You what?" "This land belonged to my old friend, Sergeant Keller. When he passed, he left it to our veterans group. I used to maintain it until the city stopped funding it. I just came to make sure no one vandalized it again." Jake glanced around, noticing the faded memorial plaque half covered in vines. The names etched into it shimmered faintly in the morning sun. "Still," Jake said stiffly, trying to hold his ground, "trespassing's trespassing." Frank sighed, then reached into his bag. Slowly, Jake tensed, hand on his gun. But Frank only pulled out a metal container and a folded American flag. He set them both down carefully. "This isn't trespassing, son. It's remembrance." Jake lowered his hand. "Look, I get it. But rules are rules." Frank looked up at him, the same calm, steady gaze from before. "Rules are important," he said softly. "But so is respect. One without the other makes a dangerous kind of power." Jake shifted uncomfortably. You're really not making this easy for me. Frank gave a faint smile. Maybe you're not supposed to have it easy. Before Jake could answer, another voice called out from behind them, firm, authoritative. Everything all right here, officer? Jake turned to see Captain Reynolds, his superior, walking toward them. Yes, sir, Jake said quickly. Just found Mr. Dalton here on the property. Was about to escort him off. Reynolds' brow furrowed. Dalton. He turned to the old man and immediately saluted. Sir, it's good to see you again. Jake blinked. Sir? Frank returned the salute casually. At ease, Captain. I was just visiting an old friend. Reynolds looked at Jake with a half-smile. You do know who you're talking to, right, Harlan? Jake hesitated. I think so, sir. This man trained half the unit that got me through basic, Reynolds said proudly. He's one of the reasons our department has a veteran partnership fund today. Jake's throat tightened. I didn't realize. Reynolds interrupted, his tone calm but sharp. Maybe next time, Harlan, you'll realize before you speak. Jake swallowed hard. Yes, sir. Frank picked up his bag and thermos. It's all right, Captain. He's young. He'll learn. Reynolds nodded respectfully. Still, let me arrange a ride for you, sir. Frank chuckled. No need. I can still walk farther than most of your recruits. As Frank walked past Jake, he paused briefly. Pride's a funny thing, officer, he said quietly. You think it makes you strong, until the moment you meet someone who's carried the weight of real honor. Then he walked away, leaving Jake standing there, speechless, ashamed, and strangely humbled. Jake watched the old man go, realizing for the first time in his career that wearing a badge didn't make him respectable. Earning it did. What he didn't know was that this was only the beginning. Within a week, Frank Dalton's name would be the center of the entire town's attention, and Jake's lesson in humility was far from over. 2 days later, the entire police department gathered at City Hall for the annual Community Honor Ceremony, a day meant to celebrate local heroes, donors, and volunteers who'd made a difference. Officer Jake Harlan stood near the back, hands clasped behind him, still trying to shake off the embarrassment of his encounter with Frank Dalton. He'd replayed that conversation in his head over and over, the calm in Frank's voice, the quiet authority in his eyes. Jake hadn't told anyone, but something about that moment haunted him. For the first time, he questioned himself, not his uniform, but the man inside it. Mayor Linda Gray stepped up to the podium. Today, we honor the people who serve not just through power, but through purpose, she began. And we have a very special guest joining us this morning. Someone whose service and sacrifice remind us what true integrity looks like. Jake glanced up and froze. Walking onto the stage was Frank Dalton, wearing the same brown jacket, freshly pressed this time, and pinned across his chest were rows of medals. Bronze Star, Silver Star, Purple Heart. The crowd rose to its feet in applause. Even officers who had no idea who he was instinctively stood taller. Frank approached the podium slowly but confidently. The mayor smiled warmly. Mr. Dalton, thank you for joining us. The city of Brookhaven owes you more than words can express. Frank gave a small nod. Thank you, ma'am. Then he turned toward the audience, scanning the rows, and his eyes landed directly on Jake. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Jake felt his chest tighten. Frank adjusted the microphone and spoke, his voice steady, deep, full of quiet gravity. I've worn many uniforms in my life, he began. Some were stained with sweat and dust, some with blood, but every one of them stood for service. And service, he said, pausing for effect, has nothing to do with age or power or rank. It has everything to do with character. The hall fell silent. Every word hung in the air like scripture. Frank continued, when I came home from my last deployment, I was proud to have worn my country's colors, proud to serve. But I'll tell you something. The hardest battles aren't always fought overseas. Sometimes they're right here, in how we treat each other. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet case. He opened it, revealing a medal of valor, dulled slightly with age, but gleaming in the light. I was given this by a general who told me it represented courage. But over time, I learned courage isn't what you do when everyone's watching. It's what you do when no one is. The audience remained completely silent. Even the mayor wiped a tear discreetly. Frank's gaze returned to Jake. "A few days ago," he said gently, "I met a young man in uniform, full of pride, full of authority, and I saw myself, many years ago, before life taught me that titles mean nothing without humility." Jake's stomach twisted. Everyone's eyes began scanning the crowd. Frank wasn't naming him, but everyone could feel it. This wasn't a speech. This was a lesson. Frank smiled faintly. "But I don't hold grudges. I only offer reminders. Because every badge, every uniform, every medal, and every piece of power only has meaning if it's used to lift others up." He closed the medal case and looked out across the hall. "So, if you wear a uniform, serve it. Don't hide behind it." The crowd erupted into applause. Loud, emotional, genuine. Jake clapped too, but his hands trembled. He felt exposed, like Frank's words had reached straight through his uniform and hit something deeper, something he didn't even know needed fixing. After the ceremony, officers gathered around Frank, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service. Jake stood off to the side, unsure whether to approach. He started walking toward the exit when a voice behind him said, "Officer Harlan." He turned. Frank stood there, smiling gently. "Leaving so soon?" Jake hesitated. "I didn't want to bother you, sir." Frank shook his head. "Son, if you think talking to someone is a bother, you're already missing the point of the job." Jake nodded, ashamed. "Sir, I owe you an apology. I shouldn't have." Frank held up a hand. "Apologies are good, but change is better." Jake nodded again, swallowing hard. "I want to do better." "I believe you," Frank said softly. "That's why I'm going to give you something." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small bronze pin, a miniature version of his service medal. "This isn't for decoration," he said. "It's a reminder. That respect isn't given by rank. It's earned by action." Jake took the pin carefully, like it was made of glass. "Thank you, sir." Frank smiled. "One day you'll have your own story worth telling. Just make sure it's one you'll be proud of." Jake nodded, his throat tight. For once, he didn't have a comeback. Just respect, real, quiet respect. As Frank walked away, Jake realized something profound. Sometimes heroes don't wear capes or badges or titles. Sometimes they just wear the weight of what they've lived through and walk through the world reminding others what decency looks like. That night, Jake took off his badge and stared at it on his desk for a long time. For the first time in years, he didn't see a symbol of authority. He saw a responsibility. And from that day forward, he decided to live like he deserved it. A week after the ceremony, Brookhaven awoke to heavy rain, the kind that blurred headlights and made every siren echo twice as loud. Officer Jake Harlan sat in his cruiser, staring at the storm from behind fogged-up glass. His thoughts drifted again, to Frank Dalton's words, to the medal he now carried in his chest pocket, and to the uneasy feeling that he still hadn't made things right. He didn't know why, but he felt drawn to do more than just learn his lesson. He wanted to prove it. The call came just past noon. Unit 24, respond to 10 to 50, rollover accident. Highway 9 near Miller's Bend. 2 occupants, 1 elderly. Jake switched on the lights and hit the gas. The rain whipped across his windshield, the wipers barely keeping up. He reached the site 10 minutes later. A pickup truck flipped onto its side, smoke curling from the hood. He jumped out, splashing into ankle-deep water. "Dispatch, I'm on scene." Through the shattered glass, he saw an older man trapped inside, blood running down his temple. And when Jake looked closer, his heart sank. It was Frank Dalton. "Frank! It's Jake!" he shouted, kneeling beside the cab. "Hang on, sir." Frank's eyes fluttered open. His breathing was shallow, but he was conscious. "You again," he rasped with a weak smile. "You just can't stay out of trouble, can you?" Jake forced a shaky laugh. "Looks like you're the one in trouble this time." He tried pulling the door, but it wouldn't budge. The frame was twisted. He radioed for backup and then grabbed his crowbar from the trunk. "Stay with me, Frank. Help's coming." Frank coughed weakly. "You don't need backup. You've got this." Jake wedged the crowbar between the door and frame, his muscles straining. The rain made everything slippery, but he didn't stop. Finally, the metal groaned and gave way. Jake reached in, cutting the seatbelt with his knife, and pulled Frank out into the rain. As he laid him on the ground, he realized Frank was holding something. A small silver pendant shaped like a cross. Frank's voice was barely a whisper. "It belonged to my son. I keep it with me for luck." Jake nodded. "You're gonna need more than luck right now. You're bleeding pretty bad." "I've had worse," Frank said softly. His lips curved into a faint grin. "But you're doing good, son. Looks like the lesson stuck." Jake pressed a hand to the wound, rain mixing with blood. "Don't talk. Paramedics are 2 minutes out." Frank's eyes searched his face. "You've got it now," he said. "Got what?" Jake asked, panicked. "The look," Frank whispered. "The one that says you finally understand what the badge really means." Jake felt his throat tighten. "Don't you dare give me your final words, Frank. You're gonna tell me that again when you're up and walking." Frank chuckled, then winced. "Fair enough." Sirens wailed in the distance. Jake stayed by his side until the ambulance arrived. The medics loaded Frank onto the stretcher, one of them glancing at Jake. "You got here fast. Probably saved his life." Jake nodded silently, his uniform soaked through. When the ambulance drove off, he stood there under the pounding rain, exhausted but alive with a strange sense of peace. He had faced fear before, but this time it wasn't about control or authority. It was about duty, the kind Frank Dalton had lived by. Later that night, Jake sat alone at the station, still in his wet uniform, filling out the report. Captain Reynolds walked in. "He's stable," the captain said. "Banged up, but doctors say he'll make it." Jake let out a deep breath. "Thank God." Reynolds leaned on the desk. "You did good out there. I told the mayor. She wants you recognized at next week's ceremony." Jake shook his head. "No, sir. Not this time. If anyone's getting recognized, it should be Frank." Reynolds smiled faintly. "You're starting to sound like him." Jake smiled too, tired but genuine. "I'll take that as a compliment." The captain turned to leave, but paused at the door. "You know, son, sometimes you don't need medals to prove what kind of man you are. Sometimes all it takes is doing the right thing when no one's watching." Jake looked down at the small bronze pin Frank had given him. It glinted faintly under the fluorescent light. He whispered to himself, "Guess the old man was right." 3 days later, Frank woke up in the hospital. When Jake walked in with a small coffee cup, Frank smiled weakly. "You again. Should have known I couldn't get rid of you." Jake chuckled. "Coffee. Black. Just like you like it." Frank accepted it, sipping slowly. "You did good, officer." Jake pulled up a chair. "I just did what you would have done." Frank nodded. "That's exactly the point." There was a moment of quiet, the kind only two soldiers of life's battles could share. Finally, Jake said, "You once told me that every uniform stands for something. I didn't get it then. And now?" Frank asked. Jake looked him in the eye. "Now I do. It's not about power. It's about service." Frank smiled, pride flickering in his tired eyes. "Then you'll do just fine." They sat together in silence as the morning sun broke through the window, soft, golden light spilling across the room. For the first time, Jake didn't feel like a cop trying to prove himself. He felt like a man who'd finally earned his place. And though neither of them said it, they both knew this wasn't the end of their story. It was the beginning of a friendship built on something deeper than respect. It was built on understanding. A month later, spring came to Brookhaven. The rain was gone, replaced by crisp sunlight and blooming dogwoods that lined Main Street. The city was holding another public ceremony. This time, not for medals or donors, but for reform. The police department had launched a new initiative called Operation Integrity, designed to bridge the gap between officers and veterans, the young and old, the privileged and overlooked. And at the heart of it all stood Officer Jake Harlan and Frank Dalton. The small auditorium buzzed with reporters, city officials, and townspeople. The air smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood floors. But Jake's hands still trembled slightly as he adjusted his tie. "Relax," Frank said beside him, leaning on his cane. "You've handled worse." Jake smiled nervously. "Yeah, but this time there are cameras. You never told me how to fight those." Frank chuckled. "You don't fight them. You just tell the truth." The mayor took the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, "today we recognize not just service but transformation. A story that started with a mistake and ended with a lesson for all of us." She gestured toward the two men. "Please welcome Officer Jake Harlan and Sergeant Frank Dalton." Applause filled the hall. Jake walked up first, heart pounding, then turned to help Frank step up beside him. Frank leaned toward the microphone. "Before you hear from the officer, you should know this. When I first met him, I thought he was another man lost in his own authority. Turns out, he was just waiting for the right reason to find his humanity." Soft laughter rippled through the room. Jake smiled, but there was a tear threatening at the corner of his eye. Then he stepped up, his voice steady but heartfelt. "When I put on this uniform," Jake began, "I thought it meant I'd earned respect, but I hadn't, not really. I only wore it. And then I met someone who showed me that respect isn't given by others. It's built from within." He looked at Frank. "This man reminded me that every person we meet carries a story. Some we'll never understand unless we listen." He paused, scanning the crowd. "A month ago, I would have seen a tired old veteran at a gas station. Today, I see a hero, a mentor, and the kind of man I want to become." Frank gave a soft nod, his eyes glistening. Jake continued, "We live in a world where people forget what service means. We chase power, we guard pride, and we forget that kindness is strength. Frank taught me that." He took something from his pocket, the small bronze pin Frank had given him. He held it up for everyone to see. "This was given to me as a reminder. I'm returning it now, because I no longer need the symbol to remember the man who gave it." Gasps filled the room. Jake stepped toward Frank, who looked momentarily surprised. Jake pinned the medal gently on Frank's jacket and whispered, "You've already earned 1,000 of these, but this one's from me." The room erupted in applause. Some people stood, others wiped their eyes. The mayor smiled, clapping the hardest of them all. Frank's voice trembled as he spoke into the mic. "You see, the world doesn't need more authority. It needs more accountability. And this young man has it. I may have earned my medals long ago, but he's earned my respect." Jake looked down, humbled. The applause continued until Frank turned to him and said, "Now, officer, let's get off this stage before they ask us to give another speech." Laughter broke through the emotion. As they stepped down, a small group of young recruits saluted them both. One of them said, "Sir, if it's okay, I'd like to join your outreach program." Jake smiled. "It's not mine, it's ours." Later, as the crowd dispersed, Frank and Jake walked outside together. The sun was setting, the sky a warm orange glow over the courthouse steps. The air felt lighter, fresher. Frank stopped at the top of the stairs, looking out at the street. "You know," he said softly, "I used to think my time was done. But seeing what you've become, it gives me hope. Maybe there's still some good left in this world after all. Jake smiled. You made me believe there is. Frank turned, his gaze full of quiet pride. Then that's enough for me. They shook hands firmly, with the unspoken bond of two men who had changed each other's lives. Jake looked at the town below them, cars glinting in the fading light, people laughing in the park across the street. You think they'll remember this? He asked. Frank smiled, eyes still on the horizon. They won't have to. You will. The two men stood there as the last light of day faded, the sound of the flag flapping softly above them. No grand music, no parade, just respect. Earned, not demanded. And for Jake, that was worth more than any medal he'd ever receive. Because he finally understood. Honor isn't what you wear on your chest. It's what you carry in your heart.